Welcome to the LDN radio show, brought to you by the LDN Research Trust. I'm your host, Linda Elseygood. I have an exciting lineup of guest speakers who are LDN experts in their field. We will be discussing low-dose naltrexone and its many uses in autoimmune diseases, cancers, etc. Thank you for joining us. This show is sponsored by Dixon's Chemist, who are the experts in LDN and associated treatments in the UK. Dixon's Chemist are the most cost-effective for LDN in all forms within the UK and Europe, maintaining safety standards far in excess of what is required. Why would you choose to get your LDN from anywhere else? Call 0141 404 6545 today to speak to their LDN experts. Today my guest is Dr. Monica Bolton from England, and she has recently had a LDN paper published. Thank you for joining us today, Monica.
Hello. Thanks for inviting me to talk about it.
Fantastic. First of all, what led you to research into LDN?
Okay, so I was a GP, and when I was 33 years old, I had meningitis. I was admitted to hospital several times. I was investigated because I was so ill, and eventually given a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis. There isn't a established name for it, really. The different countries use different names, and I'm going to call it ME at this point. So I had ME for 20 plus years, and you just get so desperate you try anything. Eventually, I was put on LDN by a private doctor in England, and my life was transformed from being housebound, unable to cope with company, having no brain function at all. I returned to a normal life, and I kept saying to my doctor, surely you should be able to write up my case report, you should be able to do a clinical trial. It can't be that difficult. And he kept saying, no, it really is difficult to do clinical trials. And, you don't believe the people. So after 2 or 3 years of asking him, I eventually thought, okay, I'm a doctor. I've also got the patient experience. I will go back to university. I will learn about clinical trials, and then I'll be able to do one. So I went back to university. I got a master's of research. And at the end of it, I can honestly say it really is that difficult to do clinical trials. So that's a sad outcome from the master's. But the one thing that I did achieve was that I did the research about safety. So what happened with that was I was banging my head, trying to find any person within the university that would be interested in a clinical trial. And eventually, a professor in general practice said to me, okay, we can't do the clinical trial, but if you're wanting to set up a clinical trial, or if you're wanting to prescribe naltrexone, what is the most important thing? And it's safety. It really is. Even if you prove a drug is effective, if it works, but if you can't prove it, if you show that it's not safe, it's not going to be used. And if you're trying to get funding for a clinical trial, you've got to be able to show the people who are funding the trial that it is safe. So as part of my Master's of Research, I did what's called a systematic review and meta-analysis of naltrexone. So what I did was then I started to look at the safety in a statistical way to see if we could prove how safe it is. So that's where it came from. Mm-hmm. So what then happens is, with a system, if you look at a single clinical trial, now clinical trials actually vary in how well they're done. So even though on paper, if you're not used to looking at clinical trials, they all look the same. If you start looking at them in details, you can see that, for instance, some of them, they haven't blinded the participants. Well, that's obvious. If you know what you're taking, you're more likely to get a positive result if you think you're on naltrexone than if you think you're on placebo. it's actually more subtle than that, because if the person who's doing the research knows if you're on naltrexone, they might start saying to you, "Ooh, have you got any side effects? Have you got any nausea? Have you got, so they can start asking leading questions. So it's very important that the clinical trials are well conducted, so the results from them, you can be sure, are accurate. Okay, so what we did was we looked at, firstly, we looked at things in a very standardized way. So we set up a protocol in advance. We said, these are the studies we're going to include. These are the studies we're going to exclude as well. And we're going to publish what we're going to do in advance so people can actually check what we did. And it means that anyone else coming along later should be able to get exactly the same results as we're getting. So we looked first, we only looked at the studies which were randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled. And that's the best way of conducting a clinical trial. It's the kind of industry gold standard. And the reason is that, for instance, the double-blind, it's obvious that if you're taking a drug and you think you're taking that drug, you are more likely to get a response than if you think you're taking a placebo, a sugar pill. But if the researcher thinks you're taking the drug, they could also change the way that they talk to you. They could say, for instance, because you know that nausea is something that people on naltrexone get, they could start asking, have you got any nausea? And the very fact that you're being asked that actually changes how likely you are to get nausea. So it's important not only that the participants are blinded, but the researchers are also blinded, and that's called double-blind. Randomizing the same. It's important if you don't randomize it so that that there's no chance of somehow there being a bias, one group more likely to respond than the other group, then you're going to somehow make the results biased in some way. So the randomization has to be completely outside anyone's control. And of course, you have to you can compare to all sorts of things, but we chose to compare with placebo. So the first thing you have to do if you're doing a systematic review is you have to look for the studies. And the more thorough the searching, the more likely you are to get an accurate result at the end. So I probably spent 3 months searching through loads and loads of databases, looking through different journals, asking people if there were any studies that they knew about, and compiling this enormous list. We ended up with over 7,000 kind of hits on the web, and you then filter these down and filter them down until you eventually came up with a number of studies that fit your criteria that you set in advance so you can check against. And we ended up with 89 studies. Now, 89 studies is an enormous number of studies, actually. Most systematic reviews end up with 3, 4, or 5 studies. We ended up with 89 studies. Wow. So that was fantastically good news, because it means that any of the statistics are very much more likely to work out. You're going to get a much more accurate result with your statistics when you've got more participants in the study. And we had over 10,000 people included in our in the studies. Now, out of those studies, we then had 26 studies where there were what we were looking for, which was the serious adverse events. So I need to explain about serious adverse events. So we were looking at safety. And the first thing I thought was, okay, we can look at all side effects. But the number of side effects, of course, in a clinical trial is enormous, because every time anyone reports anything in a clinical trial, it's now written down. So you can get lists and lists and lists of side effects. But what we chose to do was just look at something called the serious adverse events. And they have a regulatory definition, that it is absolutely defined what a serious adverse event is in all the kind of legislature that controls clinical trials. So it's the deaths, it's hospitalizations, life-threatening events, prolongation of hospitalization, persistent or significant disability or incapacity, congenital anomaly or birth defect. Now, on first thought, you'd say, well, no one on LDN is going to have any of those, so why on earth are you looking at them? And in fact, that's just not true, because if you think that LDN can be used for people with cancer can die. So in a clinical trial of cancer using LDN, it's actually quite likely that someone would die. Similarly, if you're looking at alcoholism, which, of course, because I was looking at naltrexone for any use, I was including a lot of studies for alcoholism. And the number of deaths that happen in trials for alcoholism is remarkably high. And it's a really sad reflection of alcoholism, is just how many serious adverse events are happening in those trials. So we started off with 89 studies. The good news was 53 of those studies, there were no serious adverse events, but 26 of those studies, there were serious adverse events. And the total number of studies was 315. So you then look at those studies, and you've got to statistically look at, 315 serious adverse events. So you then look at those serious adverse events, and you try and find out, is it more likely that those happened in the naltrexone arm, the placebo arm, or was there no difference? And we came out with the result that there was absolutely no difference between the naltrexone arms and the placebo arms, which is really fantastic news. In fact, the statistic that we produced, which is called the relative risk, showed that you were slightly less likely to have a serious adverse event if you were taking naltrexone than placebo. But the reduction is probably 1% reduction, so it's not a big thing there. And it's against the background where serious adverse events are not that common anyway in the majority of the trials. It actually varied enormously from trial to trial. There were some trials where 20 or 30% of participants had a serious adverse event. And one of those, as I said, was in a trial of low-dose naltrexone for cancer, right down to the other end, where the other ones where LDN was used, the fibromyalgia trials, the Crohn's disease trial that was included, where there weren't any serious adverse events. So that was the background why we did it. And the question is, well, was it worth doing? I think, yes, it was, because of the fact that this is a statistical result and that this was in over 10,000 people that we got this result from. We intuitively know that naltrexone is safe. Well, LDN is safe. Naltrexone, there's been a lot of ifing and butting about whether there's problems with liver function abnormalities. In fact, we didn't show any problems with liver problems in our study either, but that's more of a problem with the higher doses. But for LDN, we intuitively know it's safe. But if you say to the regulating bodies, well, we've no experience of people having any harms if they take LDN, they're going to say, but how can you prove that? And our paper has proved that there is no problem with it. And that is the kind of data that the regulatory bodies like. So it's going to help people who are wanting to do clinical trials because they can show our paper to the funding bodies, to the regulatory authorities and say, look, LDN naltrexone is safe. And that should help their funding. And the other thing that I really think it helps is the people the doctors who are prescribing LDN. because there aren't enough clinical trials, and certainly there aren't big enough clinical trials to individually show from the clinical trials that LDN is safe, they are prescribing really on a wing and a prayer. Because if a patient, say a patient collapsed and died and they'd been taking LDN, then their relatives could say, well, how do we know that wasn't LDN that caused that? And the doctor would be at risk of being prosecuted for using a drug that isn't licensed for that condition. But with this paper, that doctor can say, we know it's safe. This is the proof it is safe. And you might say, and I might say, well, that death is obviously not related to LDN. But you can't prove it just on a one-off, whereas you can prove it with my paper. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping that makes sense.
It does. So what's the plan? What's the plan now, Monica?
The plan, I go back to clinical trials. We need clinical trials. That's the only way that we are going to prove that the drug works. And in the UK, it's the only way that we can get it on the NHS. It's only if you've got the evidence from a clinical trial, and unfortunately, it's got to be a big clinical trial that it works. So one of the really sad things at the moment is we've got small trials of Crohn's, we've got small trials of fibromyalgia. They're not big enough to make a difference to the regulatory authorities that say, yes, this can be prescribed on the NHS. And the big trials are really difficult to fund because it's out of patent. I'm interested, obviously, in ME because that's the disease I've got. There aren't even a small trial in ME. So I'm still working for that. It's incredibly difficult. I said that at the start. The problem is, how can I don't want to sound prejudiced against drug companies, but it's drug companies that are really have made the regulatory atmosphere such. No, that's not true. The drug companies are now the only agencies that can afford to do the large clinical trials in general. And that's really sad news for off-patent drugs like naltrexone. But there is a small amount of money in the UK for funds for funding drugs like naltrexone, and we've got to build up the case for that. I'm involved in the research group still that is trying to do that. I think it will take a lot of effort, and I'm not convinced we're going to succeed, but I'm going to give it my best effort as long as I can.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So we wish you every success, Monica, because it's our aim to get LDN available on the NHS. And like you say, there is no shortcut to clinical trials and the gold standard, double-blind placebo trials.
Yes.
There are a number of people that will say, oh, you don't need clinical trials. The number of people that have been using it over the number of years, as far as it becoming available and in the doctor's little book that they can look it up, the only way it's going to get there is by clinical trials.
And the problem in the UK at the moment is that the only way you can get it is on a private prescription, and the private prescriptions cost too much for someone who is long-term ill. Even though LDN is cheap, it's still too much for someone who is chronically ill. And that is why I keep going, is because of that memory of what it was like for me to be ill, and the memory of just what it is like to wonder if you can afford the drug each month.
But I do have to say, Monica, there are thousands of people that are getting it on the NHS because any doctor can prescribe it, what they call off-patient, on a named patient basis, if they think it's of therapeutic benefit. And luckily, there are many doctors who don't mind doing that. But then there are other doctors who don't have enough knowledge of LDN, haven't got the time to do their own research, and will just say no to be on the safe side. That is sad, but that is how it will be.
They are prescribing it. they are if it is not licensed, then the doctor has to take individual responsibility for that license.
Yes.
And that is a risk for them. And as you said, some doctors are prepared to do it, some doctors aren't. I think it's slightly easier because there's been a discussion amongst the medical community about off-license, off-patent drugs recently that's clarified some of the kind of misunderstandings. But it's still the case that the doctor is personally responsible for that prescription. And that's quite an undertaking for any doctor to take on for an individual patient. And we need to get beyond that. We need to get where it's accepted that this drug works, and the only way you will do that is through a clinical trial. And the bigger the clinical trial, the better the results.
Definitely.
Sadly, as I said, with even the fibromyalgia trials and the Crohn's disease trials, we're only talking about between 10 and 30 patients that have been studied. You can't get from those number of patients, you can't get safety data, which is what I looked at, and you can't get the kind of data that the regulatory authorities will accept. They need much bigger trials. They need 100, 200 patients in a trial before they will accept the data as being worth, as the drug, that the outcomes are good enough that the drug will be licensed. There is one good bit of news going on, which is the Norwegian studies. And I hope that people are picking up on these papers that are being studied. In 2013, there was this TV documentary in Norway of a person on LDN. And following that, there's been this exponential rise in prescriptions of LDN. And Norway has a national health service, and they record all their prescriptions on one big database. And they've been able to track what happens to other prescriptions if people go on to LDN. And they've been able to show with Crohn's disease and with some of the arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, diseases like that some of the other drugs are reduced. So the what we call disease-modifying drugs, the drugs that actually make the disease go less within your body, the prescriptions for those have been reduced in people taking LDN. Now, that's a phenomenally important outcome, and that is a real-life situation. So in some ways, that trumps clinical trials. The problem with anything like that is that you can get subtle kind of biases that you just don't expect coming into the system. It might be, for instance, that the people taking LDN are a particular type of, are in some way more likely to respond to it than other people in some way that isn't clear. Which is why we still need clinical trials. But I think quoting the data from Norway is really important because it is real-life situation.
And we always say you might be one of the lucky ones that your doctor would prescribe, and to take the information and ask, because if you don't ask, you don't know. But like you say, most people end up getting a private prescription and paying for the LDN themselves. We've run out of time, Monica, but
I would never dare to...
Sorry.
There you go. That's great.
I lost you there. You'd never dare to what, sorry?
I would never dare to stop LDN.
No.
Because it is still there and would come back. At least I fear that it would come back.
Me too. Not worth the risk, is it?
It's absolutely not worth the risk. Yeah.
Well, good luck, and then hopefully we'll be able to have you back when you've done further research.
I keep my fingers crossed, and I continue to work for that. That is the goal.
Thank you, Monica. This show is sponsored by Dixon's Chemist, who are the experts in LDN and associated treatments in the UK. Dixon's Chemists are the most cost-effective for LDN in all forms within the UK and Europe, maintaining safety standards far in excess of what is required. Why would you choose to get your LDN from anywhere else? Call 0141 404 6545 today to speak to their LDN experts. Any questions or comments you may have, please email me, Linda, Linda, at ldnrt.org. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciated your company. Until next time, stay safe and keep well.